ASP.NET Core has decomposed its features into a set of variety of modules that can be individually added to a web app. All of these dependencies are injected in the startup.cs file. The importance of the startup.cs and the dependency injection associated with it is that in previous ASP.NET web applications, you had to preload a lot of different DLLs just to get your application running. With ASP.NET Core, it starts with the minimum dependency. You can start from the ground up. You are not dependent on a system.web or a lot of different assembly references. In this breakdown, an ASP.NET Core web app is completely different from a full framework app. So let's go ahead and let's look at some of these features. When your ASP.NET Core application starts, the ASP.NET Runtime calls the Configure and Startup class. If you create a new ASP.NET Core web project using an empty template, you'll find the startup.cs has only a couple of lines of code. In this case, since we created a scaffolded application, we already have some predefined configuration associated in our startup.cs file. The default web project startup class wires up MVC, entity framework, identity services, routes, etc. There are three main parts to the startup.cs file. You have the startup, which is associated as the constructor of this class. We're passing a parameter of iHost environment type. With the iHosting environment type, we can declare if we're in development mode or in production mode. So as you can see, I'm taking the parameter and I'm saying is development, and then I'm associating add application insights as developer mode true. And if I'm not in development mode, it doesn't associate that. So let's look at some of the basis of the startup class. As you see in the first variable that I've associated here, it's var builder equals new configuration builder. We are building the baseline for our configuration in our startup class. You can pretty much associate and represent this as the root configuration file that was formerly understood as the web.config in a full framework app. So I'm building a configuration, then I'm adding an extension to that configuration of a JSON method that is pulling my app settings.json. So I'm pulling the app settings.json, which we examined in the previous lecture right here. So my startup configuration is looking into this app settings.json to associate in my startup.cs. Another nice item that you can implement here is that if you add after this, you can have an add JSON, and from there you can determine what environment type you're in, if you're in production or development. So you could put an add JSON file, and I'm going to use some of the new C#6 associated syntax. So we could put that right there, and then we can put app settings. And then we can put dot env dot environment, e.v dot environment name. And once we do that, then we can say dot JSON. And then from there we can put dot optional, not dot, let's put comma, optional. And we can set that to true. So when we implement this, and this is rendered, so now that once we have that set up, what are we saying here? We can associate which environment we're in to render a different app settings JSON file. We can create one app settings.json file for our production, and we could create one app settings.json file for a development environment. So we can pick optional app setting configurations in our startup method right here. So this is what the startup method associates. It associates the configuration in our development environment. We can also say that if we're in development, something typically you'll build is you'll put the builder dot add secrets. This is where you will add your user secrets. If you're in development mode, you will not do it in production. You can add the JSON secrets file to associate in your application. And as you can see, we don't have the add secrets. That method does not exist, so we can add user secrets and restore it to our assembly. So once we do that, let's save that. And it's restoring the packages. And if we look at our references, we will see this library associated with add secrets while it restores. So now that we have that, we can see if we can find the user secrets. It should be associated in our different framework assemblies. So we can see there that we have all of our different assemblies associated. And if you see Microsoft Extensions Configuration User Secrets, now we have the user secrets available in our startup configuration. So there's a lot you can do in the startup configuration. Now that we have associated that, now we're going to configure the different services. Configure services is used to specify what services are available to this app. The default template uses helper methods to add a variety of services like Entity Framework, Identity, MVC. So we already have that pre-configured in our configure service method associated here. And you can see that right there in the configure services. In this case, in the scaffolded website, the one we selected, we didn't associate Entity Framework. We have added Application Insights Telemetry, and we've associated the configuration type right here to be passed as a parameter. Something that we'll implement later in this tutorial series is adding Entity Framework to the services. So right here, I'm going to put add Entity Framework, and it's not going to pick it up, but it's going to give me some IntelliSense to associate this. It says show potential fixes. Then we can add Entity Framework core to our references library. So once we do that and we save that, then it will associate that there. It will build a dependency in our references file. And now if we go to our DNX core, or if we look at any item associated with it, we will see the Entity Framework context core in our DNX runtime. As you can see, Entity Framework core has been installed. So we will inject that service there and make the service available for us to use. So we've added MVC, and in this case, we've added Entity Framework. So now we're just making the service available in the configure services. At the end of all of this different configuration associated, the configure method would be called by the runtime after the configure services. The configure method will be called after the configuration services. In the configuration services, we are creating the environment to inject whatever services we want in our application. So we're making them available to us to use in our ASP.NET Core application. In the configure method, we are actually utilizing the different services and configuring it to what we want to call it. So in this case, we added configure services MVC. We need to actually associate in our request pipeline how the services will route. So let's look at this. If we go down here, we see app, which we're associating with the iApplication Builder. We're passing that parameter. We have the iHosting and the iLogger, which can be used for detecting logging errors. And we can also associate, if we have an exception handler, what route do we want to put our error page to be. We have a lot of different configure services here that we're associating. We have the IIS platform handler that's associated with IIS. We're utilizing static files. We're going to examine these in a later section. But right here, I just want to take a look at, we have app.useMVC. We're creating our routes for our MVC. So we're creating a value associated with routes here. And then we're setting that route to map the route to, the naming is default, and the template is home, index, and ID. So this is going to, if we look at it in our file structure, when this application loads, it's going to look at index, it's going to look at home as its primary route. So when this application runs, this is where it's going to go first. And then at the end, this is the entry point to the application, public static void main, where we are running and passing as the value our startup class. So this is going to run our application. So all of this compilation is associated in our startup class, is going to actually run with the public static void main method, passing the startup class here. But the configure services and the configure method associate with actually adding the services to our application and then utilizing them in the configure. So this is the startup.cs class. This is your entry point to all your application dependencies, whether you're configuring a JSON file, environmental variables, if you're utilizing Windows. If you're in a development environment, you want to add telemetry, associate application insights in development and production mode. If you want to add entity framework to your configure services, adding MVC for different routing to your controllers and your views, and then configuring your hosting environment if you're in development mode, allowing static files to be rendered under your www root, and then creating your routes and your exception handlers for where the errors are in your application. So this is a startup.cs class. In subsequent lectures, we will look at how to configure this from scratch. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture.